This video will cover the end of our PowerPoint that is related to policing section 5. So one of the last things that we talked about in class was about the Fourth Amendment, and we had discussed some exceptions, and some students had some questions that were essentially pertaining to what happens if officers find evidence during their execution of a warrant that perhaps maybe wasn't what they had originally specified that they were looking for. So I did some digging, and there are a handful of court cases that have related back to this. So one of them being Horton v. California. In that particular court case, it was under the Supreme Court had examined essentially the admissibleness of evidence that is obtained through a warrant wherein it was found and it wasn't actually specified on a warrant. And so long story short with that, and other court cases have essentially determined that if evidence is obtained through a search and it was not specified on a warrant, that as long as that evidence was, the discovery was inadvertent, so it wasn't purposeful, then it is admissible in court. So essentially, like if it's an accidental discovery and if it was not purposeful discovery, then it is admissible. However, if there is an item that's not on the warrant that they're looking for, and they are purposely going out of their way to try and find that item, if it hasn't been specified in a warrant, then it cannot be admissible. It's inadmissible in court. And so ultimately to say that if evidence is obtained through a search warrant and that information or that item is not specified on the warrant, as long as it was an inadvertent discovery, then it's considered a legitimate obtainment of evidence, and so then it can be used. So that was one thing that I wanted to bring up just because I had some students who had asked about it in class. So the next thing this is the very last bit of information that we had discussed, and I had read to you the Fifth Amendment, and I started talking to you about due process and then self-incrimination. So we're going to largely focus on self-incrimination. Okay, so this is kind of where we left off. And we were discussing how the Fifth Amendment is relevant to policing. So specifically, it's relevant to interrogations because the Fifth Amendment essentially enables people not to self-incriminate. So that applies to both criminal defendants and witnesses. And although it doesn't apply to things that are not testimony. So the right or privilege to not self-incriminate is solely based on statements, so not like blood samples or things like that. But in any case, I had mentioned you a little bit about Ernesto Miranda. Was in 1963, who was charged. He was arrested for kidnapping and rape, and he ultimately signed a confession and eventually was convicted. But it was notable because he was not told his rights, that he was able to have counsel present, and then he also wasn't informed of his right to remain silent. And then additionally, he wasn't informed that what he was essentially stating in the interrogation was going to be used against him. So that was the grounds for his appeal, and eventually his conviction was overturned. And that's kind of what led way to the Miranda warning. So that's what we discussed in class later on. Oh, okay. So my next image there, that's an image of Ernesto Miranda. So then the next bit of information is what are the consequences of obtaining evidence that's illegally obtained, or even arrests that are illegal. Most relevant to illegally obtained evidence is what's known as the exclusionary rule. And the exclusionary rule arose from Mapp v. Ohio. And this was a case in Ohio in 1961 that you'll see more details about this case very briefly in a video that I'm going to ask you to watch after this lecture. But there, in that particular situation, the individuals involved in the case had a search warrant against them, and the officers had gone to the house and briefly showed the search warrant, but they were looking for something in particular. And in the case of their searching, they found someone who had an arrest warrant out. They were hiding, and then they also found like pornographic materials, I think. And originally the case was relevant to gambling, and so their findings weren't exactly obtaining or relevant to what they originally were looking for. And so this Map v. Ohio case had resulted in this decision that if evidence is not obtained properly, that it can't be used at trial. And so one of the consequences of illegally obtaining evidence is that it's losing valuable evidence that then cannot be used. So if it's inadmissible in court, that means that it cannot be used against someone. And ultimately, that's important because it has to do with, it can be the difference between a case ending in a conviction or not, right? So if we're determining our outcomes in the criminal justice system, and we are basing things on the collection of evidence and the presentation of evidence that for a higher likelihood of someone to be convicted in which they should be convicted, if there's true guilt involved, that we need to ensure that the evidence obtained is legally obtained so that the strongest case can be built against them. So something this exclusionary rule is also referred to as fruit of the poisonous tree. So if there's evidence obtained in an illegal manner, then that itself is inadmissible. So this idea of fruit of the poisonous tree is if a poisonous tree, right, that's equating to the illegally obtained or the illegal procedures. If that fruit is obtained from that tree, that poisonous tree, the fruit itself is quote unquote illegal and it's unable to be used. It's inadmissible, right? So that's kind of like the link that it's relating to with that particular quote. So outside of class, outside of this video, there's this video that's linked in the PowerPoint, and I'll also send it in a link in an email, but I want to make sure that you watch this episode outside of class. It's on search and seizure, and it relates to many of these topics. So the next thing that is relevant to these discussions are related to social issues in policing. And so in particular, if we think about some of the problems that arise in policing, and specifically related to this idea of crime control models, the model of crime control suggests that when societies are very harsh on their enforcement of laws, that sometimes individuals don't necessarily have very positive perceptions of police. And so there can be some repercussions to that, right? And in this context of police legitimacy is referring to the idea that individuals in a community, for instance, are interpreting the police in a manner that generally equates with procedural justice. And so this notion of procedural justice kind of emphasizes people's perception that policing in its process are fair. And so it has to do with like police officers treating everyone fairly, or that cases in the system move through in a fair manner, that individuals have their voices heard in whatever situation that's arising, that there is transparency in the criminal justice process in policing. And then another kind of important factor about procedural justice is that officers are impartial and they're unbiased in their enforcement of law. And so those kind of aspects that fall under procedural justice suggest that if we have higher levels of procedural justice, then there are higher levels of police legitimacy that improves people's opinions, generally, of police, okay? And one of the other things to note is that this can vary greatly by community context. So if you think about areas that have higher crime rates, that have higher police presence, those areas tend to have lower or less positive views of police. People who have had contact with police in the past generally have less positive views of police versus areas that have lower crime rates and then have generally less police presence, tend to have more positive views of police, so higher views of police legitimacy. And so things like police legitimacy and things like this notion of procedural justice all influence whether or not communities are more likely to trust police or not. And then, okay, so the next kind of point here is about the satisfaction with police. I was kind of touching this on the end of that last slide, but so there are various research studies that have examined the satisfaction with police, and so that kind of corresponds with a whole bunch of research on perceptions about the criminal justice system. So maybe their perceptions in this case, like of police and whether or not they treat people fairly, but there's a lot of research that examines people's ideas of crime or fear of crime, studies that examine people's beliefs on capital punishment. We'll read an article later this semester that's relevant to criminal justice and law enforcement students' perceptions of that and views on that. But in any case, the research has generally indicated that there's these trends or patterns in the ways in which people have lower satisfaction among police. So people who have had previous contact with police, so traffic violations, not just traffic violations, but also police-initiated contact, so arrest, stop and frisk, things like that. So those individuals who've had contact, not resident-initiated contact, are ones who have lower satisfaction in police. Generally, individuals who are living in inner city areas that have higher crime rates, more disadvantaged areas, that individuals in those areas tend to have lower satisfaction with police or more negative views of police. And then young people of color also tend to have lower satisfaction in police. And if we think about the demographics and kind of patterns of residential inequality and things like that a lot of research suggests that younger people of color are more likely to live in disadvantaged, higher crime areas. And so that may be linked with and they're more likely to have had contact with police. So that's linked with the other 2 bullet points there. And okay, that brings me to then the importance of having good relationships between officers and community members. And then if we think about it, officers are going to be more effective at their jobs when relationships with community members are positive. And so if we have strong police-community relationships, it forms a stronger partnership and ultimately can work better towards reducing crime. If we think about if individuals are afraid to talk to the police or they don't trust the police, that they're less likely to come forward in instances that police officers may need assistance in solving cases, for instance. And so it is important to build and improve communication and relations between law enforcement and communities. Another kind of topic of discussion here is known as racial profiling. And so that term, racial profiling, is when, and this is in the context of policing, right? So when law enforcement officers profile or prejudge someone, and specifically this is relating to their assumption of engaging in suspicious activity or being guilty of a crime. So it's essentially prejudging individuals and their somehow involvement in crime based on the person's race, ethnicity, or nationality. So this is specifically racial profiling, right? There's other types of profiling that occurs, but in the context of this, we're talking about racial profiling, race, ethnicity, or even nationality. And so when racial profiling occurs, that reduces police legitimacy and procedural justice. It also reduces satisfaction with police and reduces trust of police. So there's a lot of negative consequences of racial profiling. And one of the things to think about is, with regard to racial profiling, this idea that it can happen consciously, that it's something aware. So maybe if law enforcement officers have negative attitudes towards certain groups, or they hold racist attitudes, or they adhere to ideas involving racism, and then they are essentially implementing this in a discriminatory manner. So implementing things that in policing in a way that's discriminatory. So engaging in biased policing. And so this ties into our next topic or term, which is biased policing. And so while the idea of racial profiling is a way in which judging people or profiling people, assuming someone is guilty based on their race, ethnicity, or nationality, Biased policing is when the actual action is carried out in discriminatory manners, right? So in unequal enforcement of law, for instance. So biased policing. If individuals in law enforcement are targeting people, following people, questioning people solely based on that individual's race, ethnicity, nationality, sex, age, religion, socioeconomic status, right? So those are all examples of ways in which people could be targeted, right? When thinking about a lot of the context of movements in the United States today and its surrounding policing, that much of those discussions are particularly tied to race, ethnicity, sometimes nationality, sometimes socioeconomic status, sometimes sex, but also skin color. So there's different ways in which law enforcement could be biased in their policing, but it's ultimately engaging in some kind of tactics, whether it be stopping people, questioning people, arresting people, stop and frisk, for instance, additionally, arresting people or using force or even extreme measures of force like police brutality against someone solely based on their characteristics, like, for instance, race. Again, consequences of biased policing are that it reduces people's perceptions of police in a negative way, or it increases negative perceptions of police. So reducing police legitimacy, decreasing satisfaction with police, and then also decreasing individuals' trust in police. So there's a lot of negative consequences to racial profiling and then also biased policing in general. So this very last slide is just food for thought. So this is particularly related to, for instance, like TSA, for instance. But the profiling of Muslims had increased after 2001, right, after 9/11. And so I just thought that this cartoon had kind of related to that idea about the way in which responses to crime may influence the nature in which suspicion plays out and the way in which people are profiled, perhaps based on race, right? So that concludes the end of section 5 on policing. And if you have any questions, feel free to contact me and let me know.